In this video, we'll take a look at landscape painting with traditional soft pastels. For this demonstration, I'll be working on Canson Mi-Teintes paper, which is specifically designed for work with pastels. I'll be using the heavily textured side. I'm also using Rembrandt soft pastels. I'll also be using NuPastels by Prismacolor. We'll begin by addressing the sky, and I'm going to go ahead and bring an application down past the horizon line within the scene. I'm going to allow the upper part of the sky to be just a slight bit darker, and the lower portion of the sky to be a slightly lighter value. For this reason, I'll use an extremely light value of blue at the bottom. It may appear white as I'm first applying it, but it's actually a very light blue. We'll use that same light blue pastel to create the initial shapes of the clouds, and since they're fairly light and wispy, we'll use our finger to work the material into the tooth of the surface. There are a few clouds that float above close to the top of the picture plane. We'll apply shapes for them as well, sticking with the light blue. Now, our light source in this scene is originating from the left side. This means there'll be subtle highlights even within the clouds on the left side of each cloud. They're very subtle here at the beginning, and after we've established some of the lower portion of the picture plane, where the land is, we may return back to the clouds to enhance the range of value. Now, the light blue application does a great job of establishing the shapes of the clouds, but we need to add a bit of warmth. So we'll use a light cream on the side of the highlight on each one of the clouds, and gently work it into the surface. Again, this application may appear white, but it actually is a very light cream. This will give just the right amount of warmth that we need for the clouds. Now we can use the light blue that we originally used to start to define some of the shapes of the clouds a bit further. And if we need to push the value just a slight bit darker, we can use a slightly darker blue. With the sky in place, we can move our way down the picture plane. We're working, of course, from the background to the middle ground, and then lastly, we'll address the foreground. In this subject, we have a distant line of trees. I'll start to establish the shape of those trees using a dark yellow-green. As I'm establishing the shape of the trees in the distance, I'll pull the material down with my finger. This will allow for subsequent applications to be easily layered on top, in this case an application of burnt umber. We'll continue applying the burnt umber all the way down the tree line, making the value darker, and along the way we'll allow some of the strokes to extend beyond the horizon line to create the illusion of distant treetops. Now, although the application of burnt umber did make the value a bit darker, it didn't quite make it dark enough, so we'll go back with a very subtle application of black. We're careful to work this application into the surface, mixing the color, so the black is not too dominant. With the distant tree line in place, we can move on to the next area in the landscape. And this area is dominated by a very light cream color. So we'll start by applying it, working it into the surface as we go with our finger. Now, this scene is a large grassy field with a few rocks and a few trees as well. Although the grass is very tall in this field, in the distance we can't really see how tall it is. So instead of using vertical strokes here, we'll use mostly horizontal strokes to define the areas of color. As we get closer to the viewer, lower on the picture plane, we'll begin to use vertical strokes. But right now, we'll just concentrate on the horizontal shapes of color that we see. Here and there are areas of light yellow-green. There's a bit of raw umber. And there also are a few streaks of red-orange. which is one of the reasons why I've chosen to work on this surface. Some of the orange of the paper may peek through in areas, which is perfectly acceptable. Here we'll add a bit of burnt sienna to create some of those orange streaks. We'll also use a bit of yellow ochre. We'll continue to work from the reference, looking for shapes of color and value, and adding them within the scene. As we layer each application, we may use our finger to blend a bit, but in the end we want to have some applications that just sit on the surface without any blending at all. Here, a bit of light yellow-green is used as an accent color to create a few areas of highlight. We can define another set of trees that are just a slight bit closer to the viewer. They're still off in the distance, so we'll still darken the value using a bit of burnt umber. We may add a bit of dark blue as well. This will create a natural looking shadow. Of course, these details are still quite distant, and right now we're still just concentrating on the shapes of value and color that we see. We're not trying to get too consumed with the details that we know are there. Instead, we're going to trust that these details will be interpreted by the viewer when the image is complete. But for now, we're only concentrating on colors and value. A few marks with the light yellow-green on the side closest to the light source goes a long way in creating the convincing illusion of the light source originating from the left side. And to break up some of the dark tone in the distance, we'll add that color to a few places in the distant tree line. Now we can continue to work the middle ground. In this case, layering another application of the light cream color. We'll look at the shape that this area of color makes in the photo reference, and we'll try to record it as close as possible. Keeping in mind that if it's not totally accurate, it's okay, as long as the scene is still communicated to the viewer. And as we go, we'll continue to layer colors as we see them. With each application, the scene has more depth, a broader range of value, and more interest. Since we're working with pastels, we can go back and revisit areas that we've already applied material, continuing to work that section until we're completely happy with it. One of the strengths of this composition is a strip of lighter value that comes right down the center of the picture plane, almost curving down and to the left. It's almost a visual road, pulling the viewer's eye into the piece. This curve is clear in our photo reference, and we want to make sure that we preserve it in the final drawing, which we will. But for now, let's concentrate on a small grouping of trees that happens on the right side of the picture plane. Here again, we won't concentrate too much on the details. Instead, we'll just focus on the areas of value and color that are perceived in the reference. So we'll start with a light yellow-green, then a darker yellow-green. We'll make the values darker here again with a burnt umber, and then we'll go back and increase some of the highlights here with the yellow ochre. There's also a bit of red-orange that happens around this area, so we'll use a bit of burnt sienna for that, and we'll use a stronger yellow for a bit of warmth. Now there's a tree that sits by itself off in the distance. We'll start with a bit of black, then we'll use a darker yellow-green over the top. Now, for these distant trees, it may be tempting to add a lot of details, since you know they're there. But for the finished composition to make sense, we'll need to leave them very loose. When we get to the foreground, of course, we'll have higher contrast, and we'll have more detail on the marks that we make. So these distant trees will make sense then. Now let's go ahead and define that curvature that happens. We'll use the light cream for this. Remember, this is an important element in pulling our viewer into the scene, back into the background. We'll go ahead and apply that light cream color to various locations in the foreground, but we're careful not to cover the area completely. We want to preserve that curvature, so a bit of the orange paper is allowed to show through to remind us just where we need to create areas of darker value. Now we'll go back and add a few areas of red-orange with the burnt sienna. Our marks can start to become a bit more vertical as we get closer to the foreground. We'll still, of course, add some areas with horizontal marks, but now we can start to make more vertical strokes to imply tall grass. Of course, we're nowhere near the final application. We still have some more work to do in the middle ground. So we'll go back to the middle ground now and continue to define areas of color and value that we perceive in the photo reference. There are a few strips of darker yellow-green, and then there are a few rocks off in the distance. We'll define this first with a light cream color. Then we'll go back with a dark, cool gray. Over the top of this, we'll apply that light cream color again, and to warm it up just a bit, we'll add a bit of burnt sienna. Then just a touch of black. We'll work this application in with a light gray. Then we'll add just a bit of darker yellow-green around it to create somewhat of a shadow. Now, the coarse shadow on the rock is not strong enough, so we'll go back again with the black. And to make the light on the rock appear more natural, we'll go back over the application with a light cream. Another tree exists close to the center of the picture plane. We'll start by defining the shape of this tree and a couple more trees off in the distance with a black. Then again, we'll go over that black application with a dark yellow-green. Then to create the light on each one of the trees, we'll use a light yellow-green on the side closest to the light source. We'll add a strip of strong red-orange coming right across the center of the picture plane. This value and color will help to frame out the area of lighter value that helps to pull our viewer's eye into the piece. As we work, we'll continue to revisit the middle ground, making small alterations to the color and the value. We'll create another tree in the distance. Again, we'll follow the process we established before, by first establishing the shape of the tree with a black. Then we'll apply a dark yellow-green over the top of the shape. We can then establish the highlights with a light yellow-green. Now, working closer to the foreground, we can start to define some of the details. We'll start with a light yellow-green, and in this location we have some darker red-purple. So we'll use a bit of purple and apply over the top of it a red. Then we'll darken the application with a bit of burnt umber. We'll add a few highlights with a light yellow-green. A few distant patches of grass is added with the same yellow-green. A few deliberate strokes are made with the light cream. And a few patches are added with the raw umber to create some darker values and some indications of shadow. Just as we did in the distant middle ground, we'll continue to add areas of color and value as they're observed in the photo reference in the foreground. Another patch of red-purple exists in the lower right-hand corner of the picture plane. Again, we'll add purple, layer it with red, and then darken the value with burnt umber. In this case, a few marks are added with a very light and strong yellow-green. And then again, the cream is used with deliberate vertical marks to help to define each shape. We'll continue to define the tall grass that exists here in the foreground with long vertical strokes with the light cream. We'll also continue to accentuate the red-orange that's visible in the reference using the burnt sienna. We can get stronger with our applications, making deliberate marks that are not blended in. Of course, since this area is closer to the viewer, more detail is visible, as well as more contrast between darker and lighter values. And because we see more detail, there'll be more variation in color that exists in the foreground. We'll still use colors that are still in the same family. In other words, we'll still stick with yellows and greens and so on. But we'll use a variety of different yellows and greens to describe the locations in the foreground. And occasionally, as we choose a new color, we'll add it to the middle ground to produce a bit of harmony in the piece. Now, another small tree and a rock formation exist towards the center right of the picture plane. We'll start by establishing the shape of the tree, this time with the darker yellow-green. Then we'll go back with a light gray and define the shape of the rock formation. Now, we'll also add a few rocks that aren't in our photo reference. We'll do this for compositional reasons. We'll go ahead and map out the shape of those rocks now. We'll go ahead and address the rocks in the middle ground the same way that we address the rocks in the distance, with a light gray, then a darker cooler gray, then a touch of burnt sienna, and then again with a light cream to define the shape further. Now let's go back to the reasoning why we put the rocks here in the bottom left-hand corner. We want a viewer's eye to enter the piece and move through the piece. In other words, we want to create a sense of eye movement through the piece. By adding these rocks in the lower left-hand corner of the composition, we encourage that eye flow a bit further. Hopefully our viewer will be pulled in by the rocks in the lower left, onto the rocks in the middle ground, and then off to the left of the distant tree, all guided by the area of lighter value that curves right through the center of the picture plane. As the tree and the rock formation in the center of the picture plane is developed, we're sure to add highlights on the left side of these objects to create the illusion of light further. Now we'll also go back to the curve that happens in the center, and with a bit of burnt sienna, we'll make that value a bit darker and the color a bit more intense. Again, we'll revisit portions of the middle ground as we start to understand the range of value a bit further. This will happen naturally through any piece of artwork that you create, Since we're using pastels, of course, we have the luxury of going back and layering over previous applications. Now we'll go back to the foreground, and we can really start to establish some of the tall grass that exist here. Again, our strokes are vertical, and we'll allow them to curve and taper at the top to create the illusion of grass. Now, as I mentioned before, we'll have a greater level of contrast that happens in the foreground, contrast between darker and lighter values. So we'll go in with a burnt umber and we'll establish some of the shadowed areas. We'll lightly work it in with our finger before continuing on with lighter applications of value and color. Bits of yellow ochre, yellow green, and of course the cream are all used in this location, progressively building up the illusion of tall grass. And then of course we'll use the burnt umber as well to create bits of shadow and darker value. On the left side, we'll create another patch of red-purple, layering over the top of the darker applications with purple and then red, and then working it in with our finger. These areas that we work with our finger are almost an underpainting, as we apply more deliberate and stronger strokes right on top. Of course, the color underneath will show through, but the strokes placed on top are left unblended and are left to be brilliant, strong strokes of color. We can create a few highlights with the light cream, close to the top of each individual grass blade. A few strokes of strong, light yellow-green are added on top. We'll continue on to the left side of the bottom portion of the picture plane, here in the foreground, again making long strokes with the cream pastel. Notice how the bits of darker value are still allowed to show through. We'll continue to use a variety of colors in this location. Here a bit of light yellow-green, then before going any further, we'll go ahead and define all the values that exist on the rocks. Again, we'll use a dark, cool gray to define the shadows initially. Then a bit of black. But of course we won't let the black sit there alone. It's too strong. We'll go back with a darker, warm gray. And then a lighter gray in the highlighted areas. We'll make the highlights a bit stronger with a bit of white. And then to warm things up, just a touch of burnt sienna. Then again, another application of white. Now we can ground the rocks by applying the applications for the grass behind the rocks and in front of them. Once we have a bit of color, we can go back and make the highlights a bit more intense on the rocks. We can also push the shadows and the values a bit further. and in this case we'll add a bit of cast shadow with burnt umber. Now the marks for the grass are allowed to go directly over the top of the rocks, hiding the bottom portions behind the strokes. A few careful strokes made with the light cream are made in the area of darker value, allowing portions of the darker value to show through. Now a few highlights are added, with very strong and deliberate marks. These marks are made with a light cream pastel, one that is slightly lighter than the one that we've been using throughout the majority of the piece. It's decided to go back and revisit locations in the sky. We need to make the contrast between the clouds and the sky a bit stronger. So we'll go back this time with a white pastel and make the highlights in the clouds a bit stronger with an additional application. We don't want to lose the lightness and airiness of the clouds. So again, we'll gently and subtly work in that application with our finger, and then we'll clean up any of the edges with a light blue. And now our pastel landscape is complete. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and demonstration, and I wish you the very best in your own artistic journey.